6,821 Americans died on an island of 8 square miles. It remains the deadliest single battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps. And when it was over, the men who built the defense of that island could not tell anyone how it had failed. Not because they refused. Because of an estimated 21,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima, 216 were taken alive. The explanation died in the rock. In the summer of 1944, on an island that smelled of sulfur, a Japanese lieutenant general gave an order that told his own men everything they needed to know. Evacuate the civilians. There were roughly 1,000 of them. Sugar cane workers, sulfur miners, families who had been born on that black rock and had never known anywhere else. They were told to gather what they could carry and board the transports for the home islands. Some of them wept. Some of them argued. All of them went. The order was not an act of mercy. It was an act of arithmetic. Tadamichi Kuribayashi was 53 years old, and he had already run the numbers. He had walked the island end to end. 8 square miles of volcanic ash and broken stone. No fresh water, no harbor, no cover worth the name. He had looked at the terraces above the southern beaches and understood that anything standing on them would be atomized. And he had reached a conclusion that no one in Tokyo wanted written down. Everyone on this island was going to die. So he sent away the people who did not have to. To understand why Japanese commanders could never fully explain what happened on Iwo Jima, you have to start with the man who built the thing that failed. And you have to understand something uncomfortable about him. He knew America better than almost any officer in the Imperial Japanese Army. Between 1928 and 1930, Kuribayashi served as a military attaché in Washington. He bought a car and drove west across the plains and the industrial belt, through towns whose names meant nothing to Tokyo and everything to the war that was coming. He saw the factories. He saw the highways. He saw the sheer, casual, unhurried scale of it. Afterward, he served as military attaché in Canada. He came home with an opinion that made him dangerous in his own army. That Japan should never, under any circumstances, go to war with the United States. He wrote letters home to his wife, Yoshii. Small letters. Domestic ones. He drew pictures in the margins for his children, sketches of himself, of things he had seen, little cartoons in a careful hand. He worried about the kitchen floor at home. He worried about drafts in the house. He also wrote from Iwo Jima that he did not expect to return. Hold both of those facts at once, because the story does not work if you round him off into a hero or a monster. He was neither. He was a professional. And what he was about to build on that island was the most efficient machine for killing and dying that the Imperial Japanese Army ever put into the ground. The doctrine he inherited said this: stop the Americans at the waterline, meet them on the beach, destroy them where they are weakest, in the surf, tangled in their own equipment. Tarawa had proven that doctrine could bleed the Americans badly. Saipan had proven it could not stop them. Kuribayashi had read the after-action reports. He had seen what naval gunfire did to concrete on the shoreline, and he understood that a defense you can see is a defense you can delete. So he threw it out. He told his commanders there would be no defense of the beaches. He told them there would be no banzai charges, no massed final attacks, no glorious suicidal rushes into machine gun fire. Those attacks had killed Japanese soldiers by the thousand, and won nothing. He forbade them. This did not make him popular. Officers of the old school considered the ban close to dishonorable. Some argued. Some senior officers strongly opposed the policy, though Kuribayashi ultimately enforced it. And to hold the line, Kuribayashi issued a document to every man on the island. 6 articles. It was called the Courageous Battle Vows. Do not die until you have killed 10 of the enemy. Read it again and notice what is not in it. There is no article about victory. There is no article about relief or reinforcement, or holding until help arrives. There is no date in it anywhere. The document does not promise the men anything except a quota. He was not telling them how to survive the battle. He was telling them what he expected them to be worth on the way out. Among the officers who came to that island was a man the American press had once photographed smiling. Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi was 42. In 1932, at the Los Angeles Olympics, he had won the gold medal in equestrian show jumping, riding a horse he had bought himself named Uranus. He had been a minor celebrity in Southern California. He knew film people. He was, by every account, charming. He arrived on Iwo Jima commanding the 26th Tank Regiment, and he was ordered to do something that no cavalryman would ever have volunteered for. Bury the tanks. Not fight them. Bury them. Dig pits in the volcanic rock, back the machines in, pack them over with ash and stone, until only the gun protruded, and turn a mobile regiment into a line of fixed steel bunkers that would never move again. He did it. The man who had won a gold medal on a moving horse spent his last months entombing his own vehicles in the ground. And then came the digging. For roughly 8 months, in shifts around the clock, the garrison excavated the inside of the island. Estimates of the plan run to about 27 kilometers of tunnel. Estimates of what was actually completed run to roughly 18. Call it 11 miles of passages, chambers, magazines, and firing positions carved into volcanic rock by hand tools, pneumatic drills, and explosives. Understand the conditions because the conditions are the story. There was virtually no natural fresh water on Iwo Jima. Most drinking water had to be collected from rain or shipped in. Most of the garrison's drinking water came from rain collected in cisterns or from shipments that increasingly struggled to reach the island because of American submarines and aircraft. Men worked thirsty for 8 months. The rock was volcanically active. Sulfur gas seeped up through the seams. In some galleries, the heat was brutal enough that work parties could last only a few minutes before they had to climb out into the open air, gasping, and let the next team go down. The soil in places was hot enough to cook on. Men who dug in the wrong spot could not stay in their own holes. They built hospitals down there, command posts under many meters of rock, ammunition rooms with steel doors, passages connecting hundreds of bunkers, and caves so that a position could be abandoned and reoccupied and abandoned again, without a single man ever showing himself on the surface. By February 1945, an estimated 18 to 21,000 Japanese soldiers were inside that island. Not on it, inside it. Now cross the water. The Americans were not naive. Major General Harry Schmidt, 58 years old, commanding V Amphibious Corps, looked at the aerial photographs and asked for 10 days of naval bombardment before the landing. He got 3. The reasons were logistical and they were real. Ammunition supply, the timetable for Okinawa, competing demands across the Pacific. But the answer was still no. Lieutenant General Holland Smith, 62, whose temper had earned him the nickname Howlin' Mad, protested and lost. What the island did receive was 74 consecutive days of aerial bombardment, the longest sustained air campaign against any target in the Pacific War. Then, over 3 days, roughly 22,000 naval shells. Men who had survived Tarawa stood at the rails and told each other that nothing could live through that. Here is the first thing the Japanese command could never adequately explain afterward, and here is the first thing that should have warned everyone. It barely mattered. 74 days of bombing and 3 days of shellfire had been directed at the surface of an island, whose defenders were not on the surface. Reconnaissance had plotted dozens of positions. There were hundreds. The Americans were bombarding a shell. Every ton of explosive that hammered the terraces was landing on top of men sitting in rock galleries 40 feet down, listening, waiting, and in some cases sleeping through it. The beaches were not defended. That was not a failure of the Japanese plan. That was the plan. Kuribayashi had given the shoreline away deliberately, because the shoreline was the trap. His real line began roughly 200 meters inland on the high ground, and in the ridges, positioned so that flat trajectory naval guns firing from the sea could not reach into it, and sighted so that every weapon on the island interlocked with every other weapon, covering the black terraces in overlapping fields of fire. He was not going to contest the landing. He was going to permit it. On the morning of February 19, 1945, the first waves went in. By the end of the day, roughly 30,000 Marines would be ashore. And the first thing they noticed was the silence. No shellfire, no machine guns, nothing. Men came down the ramps into knee-deep black ash and looked at each other, waiting for it to start, and it did not start. They moved off the waterline. They began to climb the terraces, and the volcanic sand collapsed under their boots like wet gravel, and still nothing came. Some of them let themselves believe the bombardment had worked, that this one finally would be different. For about an hour, the landing was almost unopposed. An hour is a long time, long enough for the beaches to fill, long enough for the second waves and the third and the vehicles and the ammunition and the radios and the men to stack up in a solid mass of flesh and steel with the ocean behind them and nowhere to dig because the ash would not hold a hole. Inside the island, at every gun, the order had already been given and understood. Wait, do not fire. Wait until the beach cannot hold another man. At around 10 in the morning, Kuribayashi let them come far enough. Then he opened the island. The island did not fire at them. The island fired from inside itself. Mortars came first, because the beaches had been carefully pre-registered long before the landings. Then the artillery on the high ground to the north. Then the guns dug into Suribachi to the south, firing down the length of the terraces. Then machine guns from numerous concealed positions sighted in concrete and rock so that their fields of fire crossed and recrossed until there was no line a man could walk that did not pass through at least 3 of them. The Marines on that beach were caught in a bowl, ocean at their backs, rising black terraces in front, and the volcanic ash would not hold a foxhole. Men clawed at it and watched the walls pour back in like water. There was nothing to get behind. There was nothing to get under. There was only forward, and forward was uphill through loose ash that took a man to his ankles with every stride and pulled the strength out of his legs. Landing craft kept coming. They had to. The schedule did not care what was happening on the sand. So more men came ashore into a beach that was already a shooting gallery, and the wreckage piled up behind them. Jeeps burned down to frames, Amtraks on their sides, ammunition crates, radios, stretchers, and the dead laid in rows above the tide line, because there was nowhere else to put them. By nightfall on February 19, 1945, American casualties on Iwo Jima numbered roughly 2,400. One day, one beach. Among them was a gunnery sergeant named John Basilone. He was 28 years old. He had already received the Medal of Honor for Guadalcanal, and he had already been sent home to sell war bonds, and he had already done the thing that almost nobody does, which is to look at a comfortable safe assignment in the United States and ask to go back. He got his wish. He was killed on the beach on the first morning, along with 4 of the men he was leading forward. He had been on the island for less than 2 hours. And here is the detail that the men who survived that day carried with them for the rest of their lives, and that they mentioned over and over again in interviews decades later in living rooms with grandchildren in the next room. They never saw anybody, not one Japanese soldier, not a helmet, not a muzzle flash, not a man running between positions. The fire came out of the ground, out of slits in the rock the size of a mail slot, from firing ports built at angles that could not be spotted from the front. Marines fought all of the first day, and much of the second against an enemy that, as far as their own eyes were concerned, did not exist. You cannot shoot back at a hillside. That was the entire design. Still, they moved, because that was the other half of the equation, and Kuribayashi had underestimated it. On the first day, elements of the 28th Marines drove straight across the narrow neck of the island, from the eastern beaches to the western shore, through the worst of it. It is about 800 yards. Took them most of the day, and it cost them terribly. But by evening, they had cut the island in two, and Mount Suribachi, the dead volcanic cone at the southern tip, 550 feet of rock riddled with guns, was severed from the rest of the Japanese defense. Then they turned and started up it. Suribachi took 4 more days. There was no clever way to do it. There was no maneuver. There was a slope covered in gun positions, and Marines went up that slope with satchel charges and hand-carried flamethrowers, and they burned and blasted one hole at a time. The flamethrower operator was the most important man in the assault, and everyone in the squad knew it, including the Japanese gunners who shot at him first. He carried roughly 70 pounds of fuel and pressurized tanks on his back, walking upright toward a machine gun. His chances of survival were notoriously low, and Japanese defenders often targeted flamethrower operators first. One of them was Corporal Tony Stein, 23 years old, from Dayton, Ohio, who had built himself a custom weapon from an aircraft machine gun and used it on the first day to cover his platoon, while it worked up the terraces, going back to the beach again, and again for ammunition, barefoot at the end, because it was easier to run in the ash without boots. He was awarded the Medal of Honor. He did not live to receive it. He was killed on March 1st, still on the island 10 days later. That is the pattern for this battle. Almost every name you will hear has that shape. There is what the man did, and then there is the date, and the date is usually close. On the morning of February 23rd, Day 5, a 40-man patrol from the 28th Marines, led by First Lieutenant Harold Schreier, 28, climbed the last of the cone, expecting to be slaughtered on the crater rim. Almost nothing happened. The defenders in Suribachi were mostly dead, or sealed in, or waiting deeper down. The patrol reached the top, found a length of Japanese water pipe, tied a small American flag to it, and put it up. And then, down on the beaches and out on the ships, thousands of men, who had spent 4 days being killed by an island they could not see, looked up and saw color on the summit. They cheered. Every ship in the anchorage sounded its horn at once. Men wept openly on the sand. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, who was ashore that morning, watched it go up and said that the raising of that flag meant a Marine Corps for the next 500 years. That first flag was small, too small to be seen clearly from the far end of the island. So a few hours later, a second, larger flag was carried up, and a group of Marines raised it, while the first one came down. An Associated Press photographer named Joe Rosenthal, 33 years old, a civilian, nearsighted enough that he had been rejected for military service, was on the summit with a speed graphic camera. He almost missed it. He was building himself a little platform out of rocks and a sandbag when he caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. He swung the camera up and shot without looking through the viewfinder. He did not know what he had. He shipped the film out with everything else and went back to work. That photograph won the Pulitzer Prize. It became one of the most reproduced photographs in the history of American journalism. It became a war bond campaign, a postage stamp, and eventually a bronze monument in Arlington, Virginia, whose figures stand 32 feet high. And now I have to take something away from you, because for 80 years that image has done a specific and unintended kind of damage to the memory of this battle. It looks like an ending. 6 men, straining together, pushing a flag into the sky. It has the shape of a finish line. It was Day 5. The battle lasted 31 more days after that photograph was taken. Suribachi is the southern tip. Everything else, the plateau, all 3 airfields, the ridges, the quarries, the northern highlands, and the overwhelming majority of Kuribayashi's garrison, and his tunnel system lay to the north and had not been touched. Somewhere in the range of 80% of all American casualties on Iwo Jima occurred after that flag went up. The men in the photograph knew it. That is the part that never makes it onto the postage stamp. 3 of the 6 men who raised that second flag were killed on the island within the following weeks. And the Marine Corps itself has twice had to correct the record on who was in the picture, once in 2016 and again in 2019, because the men were photographed from behind in identical dungarees in a moment none of them thought was important. They were not posing for history. They were putting up a flag so that a battalion 2 miles away could see it, and then they went back down the mountain to keep fighting. The cheering stopped by that afternoon. North of the first airfield, the island changes character. The ground rises into a broken plateau of ridges, ravines, quarries, and stone outcrops. Kuribayashi had spent 8 months turning it into a single interlocking system, and the Marines who had to cross it gave one particular sector a name that stuck. The meat grinder. It was 3 positions, and the 3 positions were the whole problem. Hill 382, named for its height in feet, the highest ground in the north. A blockhouse-crowned rise the Marines called Turkey Knob, and a natural bowl in the rock below it which they called the amphitheater. Individually, each one was a hard fight. Together, they were something else. Every one of the three could put fire onto the approaches to the other two. Take Hill 382, and you were now standing in the open under observed fire from Turkey Knob. Push into the amphitheater, and you were in a stone bowl with guns looking down into it from two directions. There was no flank. That is what men could not get across to people back home. On an island 4.5 miles long, in a sector you could walk across in 10 minutes on a Sunday, there was nowhere to go around. The 4th Marine Division went into the meat grinder in late February. They were still fighting for it in the second week of March. The advances in that sector were sometimes measured in yards per day. Not miles, not hundreds of yards. Yards. A company would take a piece of ground in the morning, hold it through the counterfire, and be relieved, that night having moved the line the length of a suburban backyard. And in the middle of it, the thing that broke men's nerves more than the artillery, the positions came back. A rifle company would assault a cave complex, kill everyone they could find inside it, seal the mouth, mark it cleared, and move on. 2 hours later or 2 days later, fire would come from that exact position. Not from a nearby one, from the one they had personally cleared with their own hands at a cost they could have named man by man. It happened on the first day. It happened on the 10th. It happened on the 30th. This was not Japanese fanaticism. It was Japanese engineering. The Americans were fighting a two-dimensional war. Their maps were flat. Their operations orders described lines and phase lines and objectives on a surface. Their whole professional vocabulary assumed that ground taken was ground held. Kuribayashi had built a fortress in 3 dimensions. Underneath the flat map, an estimated 11 miles of passages connected those positions to each other. When a bunker was assaulted, its garrison did not have to stand and die in it. They could withdraw down a shaft, move laterally under the feet of the advancing Marines, and come back up behind them into the same position or a better one. Every operational map drawn by the Americans on Iwo Jima was, in a fundamental sense, a map of the wrong battle. It described the top of something. The fighting was inside it, and so the Marines had to invent a way to fight that no manual described. Later, on Okinawa, the method would get a name: blowtorch and corkscrew. On Iwo Jima, it did not have one yet. It was just what you did. There was nothing elegant about it. There was no breakthrough, no envelopment, no brilliant stroke. It was a demolition problem solved under fire, one hole at a time. Riflemen pinned the firing slit. Demolition men crawled up on the blind side with satchel charges. Flamethrower men burned the aperture and everything behind it. Then the engineers packed the entrance with explosive and brought the roof down, because if you did not collapse it, it would be reoccupied. It worked. It was also, in terms of American lives, the most expensive way to take ground that the Marine Corps had ever used, because every single one of those actions put men upright and in the open at close range. Which brings us to the weapon that actually decided the fighting on Iwo Jima, and it was not the naval gun, and it was not the artillery, and it was not the bomber. It was a Sherman tank with a flamethrower in it. There were only a handful of them on the island. The number usually given is 8. They were M4A3 Shermans, modified so that the flame gun fired through the main armament position, which meant that, from a distance, a Japanese observer could not tell them apart from a regular tank until it was too late. They could throw burning fuel a good distance, and they could sustain it, which was the part that mattered. Because a flame weapon against a cave system is not really a burning weapon. It is a suffocation weapon. The fuel goes in through the aperture and it consumes the oxygen in the chamber, and it keeps consuming it down the passage, around corners, into the chambers behind. Depth did not save you. Turns did not save you. Many Japanese survivors later recalled the flamethrower tanks as among the most terrifying weapons they faced. Not the shelling, the tanks. Because artillery is chance and the flame tank was certainty. You could hear the engine above you. You could feel the vibration in the rock. And then you had somewhere between a few seconds and no time at all. The flame tanks were used so continuously that refueling and rearming them became a scheduling problem for the whole Corps. On some days, they were the only reason the line moved at all. Marine commanders afterward called them the most valuable weapon system in the campaign. And Kuribayashi, for all his intelligence, for all his 8 months of preparation, had no counter to them. He had built a system whose central assumption was that depth equals safety. Everything followed from that. The tunnels, the sealed magazines, the command posts 40 feet down. And the Americans arrived with a machine that turned depth into a liability because in a sealed system, the fire only has one place to go, and so do the men. Notice what has happened by the 3rd week. His plan is working. That is what makes this story what it is. Every element of the Japanese defense is functioning as designed. The Marines are taking appalling casualties. The advance is measured in yards. The exchange is closer to even than in any other Pacific Island battle. And the Americans are still coming at the same speed with the same weight every single morning. Kuribayashi's dispatches to Tokyo in the 2nd and 3rd weeks of the battle are not the messages of a man who is panicking. They are the messages of a professional soldier reporting an anomaly. He tells Tokyo, in effect, that the Americans are not behaving the way they are supposed to behave. They are absorbing losses that should have stopped a force of that size, and they are not stopping. There is almost a note of professional respect in it. He is describing a machine he has never seen before. Here is what he got wrong. Not the terrain, not the tunnels, not the tactics. He got those exactly right. He got the institution wrong. Japanese doctrine on Iwo Jima was built on attrition. Bleed the enemy past his tolerance, and he will stop. That reasoning had worked in China. It had worked in Southeast Asia in the early years. It rested on an assumption so obvious that nobody in the Imperial Army wrote it down. Every army has a bottom. A rifle company takes 50% casualties, and it stops being a rifle company. It becomes a group of exhausted survivors who need weeks to rebuild. That is not cowardice. That is how military organizations work in every army, in every war. On Iwo Jima, a Marine rifle company could take 50% casualties in a day, and the next morning the replacements would arrive. Not raw recruits scraped up in a panic. Trained Marines drawn from replacement drafts that had been sailed to the objective in advance, sitting on transports offshore for exactly this purpose. The Americans had planned replacement drafts and medical evacuation into the operation before the first landings. They had planned for the bleeding and shipped the blood with the ammunition. And the medical system did something Kuribayashi's frame of reference had no room for at all. Navy corpsmen went forward with the assault squads, carrying little more than a sidearm and a medical bag, and were killed in numbers that are hard to look at even now. Wounded men were carried back across that ash to the beach, loaded onto landing craft under fire, and taken out to hospital ships offshore, where surgeons worked around the clock. By early March, transport aircraft were flying casualties off the captured airfield directly. A Marine with a survivable wound on that island had a genuine chance of being alive that night in a clean bed with a doctor over him. Some men with lighter wounds were back with their units in days. Now hold the two systems side by side, because this is the answer to the question this whole story is built around, and it has nothing to do with courage. The Japanese garrison on Iwo Jima could not be reinforced. Not one man, not one round. American submarines and aircraft had cut the sea lanes so completely that, from the moment the fleet appeared over the horizon, every soldier, every bullet, and every liter of water on that island was all there would ever be. Their strength could only ever go in one direction. Their wounded went into the underground hospitals and stayed there. The American force could regenerate itself faster than the Japanese could destroy it. That is the whole thing. That is the entire secret. There was no trick, no genius, no wonder weapon. Kuribayashi built a defense designed to exhaust an enemy, and he was fighting the one enemy in the world at that moment who could not be exhausted because they were feeding themselves back into the fight faster than he could take them out. He was subtracting from a number that kept being added to, and he was subtracting from a fixed number of his own. On March 4th, in the middle of all of this, with the northern third of the island still in Japanese hands, and men dying by the hundred on the ridges, a crippled B-29 superfortress came in low, over the water, and put down on the captured airfield at the southern end. It was called Dynamite. It was low on fuel, and could not have made it back to the Marianas. The crew climbed out onto an airstrip that was still within range of Japanese guns, while Marines fought for the high ground 2 miles north of them. The aircraft was worked on, turned around, and took off again. 11 men. That aircraft is the argument. That is the justification for everything on this island, and you will hear it repeated for the rest of the war, and for 80 years after. It is not a small thing, and we are going to come back to it because it is not as simple as it sounds. But on March 4th, nobody on Iwo Jima had time to think about arguments. Because up north, in the ridges above the 3rd airfield, in a system of ravines the Marines had not even fully mapped yet, the Japanese defense was still intact, still firing, still commanded. And Kuribayashi was about to lose the one thing his entire design had never accounted for losing: his ability to see his own battle. At the northern tip of Iwo Jima, where the island runs out into the sea at a place called Katano Point, there is a gorge in the rock. It is roughly 700 yards long. On an operational map, at the scale the staff officers were working with, it is barely a mark. A thumbnail, a wrinkle in the last piece of ground. Took 10 days. By the middle of March, the shape of the battle had changed, though nobody used the word that would have described it honestly. There was no longer a Japanese line. There was no longer a Japanese front. What remained were pockets. Separate systems of caves and ravines, each one still fully armed, each one still fighting, and each one now completely cut off from the others. In the center of the island, the 3rd Marine Division ran into one of them. It was a complex of caves and bunkers and broken ground that would not fall to anything, and it was reduced over more than a week of the same brutal arithmetic. Riflemen, satchel charges, flame tanks, seal the hole, move 20 yards, do it again. That position took its name from the officer whose battalion finally cleared it. Lieutenant Colonel Robert E. Cushman, Jr., 30 years old, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 9th Marines. 27 years later, he would be Commandant of the Marine Corps. In March of 1945, he was a young man with a map and a problem that had no solution except the one that killed his own people. Cushman's pocket. That is how it entered the record. A man's name attached forever to a piece of rock he did not want, and could not go around. And in the north, in the gorge, the last of Kuribayashi's army went into the ground for the final time. The 5th Marine Division fought down that ravine yard by yard for 10 days. The walls were stone. The floor was littered with the wreckage of the last 8 months of Japanese engineering. There were still guns in there. There were still men in there who had been given a quota and had every intention of filling it. Somewhere in that northern rock, in a command post that has been argued about ever since Tadamichi Kuribayashi was sending his last messages. And here is the thing his own design had done to him. He had built a defense that would keep fighting after it was cut apart. That was the entire point. Every position was meant to function on its own, indefinitely, without orders, without support, without hope. He had engineered independence into it because he knew that command and control would be the first thing the Americans destroyed. It worked. It worked so well that by the 3rd week, the man who had designed the battle could no longer see it. His units were not reporting because most of them no longer existed as units. The telephone lines had been cut and burned. Runners could not cross ground the Americans owned. Whole sectors had simply gone silent, and silence meant nothing. Could mean annihilated, or it could mean still fighting underground with no way to say so. He had one channel left to the outside world. Radio traffic to Chichijima, 150 miles to the north, where a staff officer named Major Yoshitaka Hori was receiving. That is it. That is the wire. Almost everything the world knows about the Japanese side of this battle, the state of the garrison, the thinking of its commander, the final days, the last words, came out through that one radio link to one man on another island, plus the interrogations of a few hundred prisoners, and whatever documents survived the fire. 20,000 men fought that battle. The record of what they experienced is a handful of telegrams. The last of them came in the second half of March. In it, Kuribayashi reported that his forces were finished, that ammunition and water were gone, that organized resistance was ending. He apologized to the homeland for failing to hold the island. He asked that his troops be remembered, and he attached 3 death poems in the old form as a Japanese officer of his generation was expected to do. Tokyo published a version of that message. Decades later, the Japanese journalist Kumiko Kakahashi, working through the original texts, documented something that says more about the war than the battle does. The final poem had been altered before publication. The word Kuribayashi actually used carried bitterness, a sense of galling, mortifying regret. What appeared in the newspapers of Imperial Japan was softer, cleaner, more acceptable. The last honest thing the man ever wrote was edited before his country was allowed to read it. He was posthumously promoted to full general. Accounts differ on whether word of it ever reached him. We do not know how he died. That is not a dramatic flourish, it is the state of the evidence. There are accounts. They contradict each other. His body was never identified. The man who planned every meter of that island's defense simply stops appearing in the record. On the night of March 25th, somewhere between 200 and 300 Japanese soldiers came up out of the ground for the last time. They did not do it the way the Imperial Army had done it on a dozen other islands. There was no screaming rush into machine gun fire. This was quiet and organized, and it was aimed at a specific place, a bivouac area near the 2nd Airfield on the western side, where the fighting was supposedly over. The men sleeping in those tents were Army Air Forces pilots, who had flown in to base on the island. Seabees, Marine shore parties, support troops, men who had been told the hard part was finished. The attack came into them in the dark at close range in the middle of the night on the last night. The unit that stopped it was the 5th Pioneer Battalion, a shore party outfit, men whose job was moving supplies off a beach. First Lieutenant Harry L. Martin, 34 years old, from Bucyrus, Ohio, organized a line out of whatever men he could reach in the dark, went out under fire to pull wounded Marines back in, drove the Japanese out of positions they had already taken, and was killed leading the counterattack that finished it. He received the Medal of Honor. He was the 27th awarded for Iwo Jima, and the last. 27 medals of honor for a single operation. More than for any other battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps. Who led that final attack is still argued over. Some accounts place Kuribayashi at its head. Others hold that he was already dead. The evidence does not settle it, and honest history has to say so. At about 9 in the morning on March 26, 1945, the island was declared secure. 36 days. The word secure is a technical term, and it should be understood as one. What it meant was that organized resistance had ended, and the operation was over. It did not mean the island was empty. The 147th Infantry Regiment of the United States Army took over garrison duty. During the following months, they continued clearing isolated holdouts, killing or capturing hundreds more Japanese soldiers who had refused to come out of the caves, and took several hundred prisoner. The final numbers: approximately 26,000 American casualties, 6,821 Americans dead. It remains the bloodiest battle in the history of the United States Marine Corps, and Iwo Jima holds a distinction that belongs to no other battle in the Pacific War. Total American casualties exceeded total Japanese casualties. By the measure Kuribayashi had chosen, making the invasion as costly as possible, he came closer to achieving his objective than any previous Japanese island commander. Of the Japanese garrison, estimated at 18 to 21,000 men, 216 were taken prisoner during the 36 days. Roughly 800 more came out of the ground over the following months, bringing the total taken alive to about 1,000 by the end of the war. Which brings us back to the question this entire story is built around. Why could Japanese commanders never adequately explain how the island fell in 36 days? There are 3 answers, and they get worse as they go. The first is that Kuribayashi never asked the question. Look again at what was missing from those 6 vows. There was no date in them. He was not asked how long. He was asked how much. His entire design was optimized for cost, not for duration. Every tunnel, every buried tank, every interlocking field of fire existed to raise the price of the island, and there was no mechanism anywhere in that plan for preventing the island from falling. It was never intended to hold. It was intended to bill, which means the speed of the collapse was a number he never calculated because it was never his objective. The second answer is that by the middle of the battle, the Japanese command could no longer observe its own defense. The system was too well decentralized. Positions fought and died in isolation, in the dark, underground, with nobody reporting anything to anyone. The man in command was reduced to a single radio wire to another island. He could not have written an account of the battle even if he had survived it, because after a certain point he was not watching a battle. He was listening to silence and guessing. And the third answer is the hardest one. In every army in the world, explanation is the work of survivors. Someone walks off the field, sits down in a room, and says what happened. That is how doctrine is written. That is how the next war is fought differently. It requires men who lived. Kuribayashi built a system in which surviving was not part of the design. 216 prisoners out of a garrison of 20,000. Almost no staff officers. Almost no one who had seen the plan whole. The men who could have explained the defense of Iwo Jima died inside the defense of Iwo Jima, sealed in the rock, exactly as they had been ordered to. He succeeded. That is why there is no explanation. He made sure there would not be one. Now, the argument. For 80 years, the justification for this battle has been an airfield. 2,251 B-29 landings on Iwo Jima before the war ended. Standard crew of 11. Multiply it out and you get a number around 24,000, and that number has been carved into the meaning of this island ever since. 6,800 Marines died, and 24,000 airmen came home. It is a clean trade. It has comforted a great many families. It also does not survive close examination, and honesty requires saying so. The historian Robert Burrell has argued that the figure is badly misleading. Not every one of those landings was an emergency. Aircraft put down on Iwo Jima to refuel, to train for minor mechanical issues on routine business. Counting every man aboard every landing as a life saved assumes that every one of those aircraft would otherwise have gone into the sea, and that is not what the records show. Burrell's further argument is sharper, that the life-saving rationale was assembled largely after the fact when the casualty lists came home and the cost had to be explained to the American public. The original strategic case for taking Iwo Jima was different. It was about eliminating the Japanese airfields that were harassing the B-29 bases in the Marianas, and about basing American fighter escorts closer to Japan. Both of those reasons were real in the planning documents. Both of them were also overtaken by events. Long-range escort proved impractical, and the bombing campaign shifted to low-altitude night attacks that did not use escorts at all. Other historians push back hard on Burrell. They point out that the emergency landing capability was genuine, that crews at the time believed it absolutely, and that you cannot judge a wartime decision by outcomes nobody could have known. Both sides of that argument are held by serious people. This is not a settled question, and it is not going to be settled here. What can be said without argument is this. 6,821 American families received a telegram. Somewhere between 18 and 21,000 Japanese families never received anything at all. No body, no grave, no account of how or where, and the island kept its own time. In January of 1949, more than 3 years after the war ended, 2 Japanese soldiers came out of a cave on Iwo Jima and surrendered. They had been living underground on scavenged supplies. They had missed the end of the war by more than 3 years. There are still remains in that rock. Recovery teams work there to this day. The majority of the Japanese garrison has never been found. And there is one last thing which is small and which says everything. The island is not called Iwo Jima. Its name in the local reading was always Iwo. The pronunciation that the world learned came into wide use through Japanese naval officers during the war, and it stuck. carried into American reports, into headlines, into the name of a photograph, into a monument in Virginia. In 2007, the Japanese government formally restored the original. 80 years of history are attached to a name that was a mistake. So was the plan. Kuribayashi answered the only question he ever asked himself. He wanted to know what the island would cost, and he found out precisely to the man. He never answered the question Tokyo asked. How long? And he never could have. Because to answer that one, somebody has to come back.